Welcome to Bed Crime Stories podcast. I'm your host, T. To my bed crimers, hi, how are you? I hope you're having a wonderful day. To anyone new here, a warm welcome. Thank you for checking out my channel. All I ask is that after listening to and or watching the video, if you find you enjoyed it, learned something, do me a favor, smash the like button and please consider subscribing. And if you want to help me survive on these harsh YouTube streets, please consider a membership or a Patreon membership. I keep the price low at $1.99 because I know money is tight. With all that out of the way, let's get started. Cell phones and cell towers leave breadcrumbs that law enforcement can use to solve crimes. The Adelson case was solved in large part thanks to these evidentiary nuggets. During Charlie Adelson's trial, the state called Tallahassee PD's Sergeant Chris Corbett to share powerful cell phone and cell tower evidence against Charlie. Phone logs showed that on key dates, including the day of the murder, calls between Charlie and his then-girlfriend, Catherine or Katie Magbanua, were often followed by calls between Charlie and his mom, Donna, and his sister, Wendi, as well as calls between Katie and Sigfredo Garcia. When Sergeant Corbett was on the stand, he was asked, quote, "So looking at situations where one of these conspirators hangs up with one and immediately calls the other, that can be something that stands out to investigators," end quote. Corbett replied simply, "Yes." Let me give you an example. On July 15th, Luis Rivera rented a 2008 Toyota Prius in Miami, and it was the car that he and Sigfredo Garcia used to drive to Tallahassee. On the rental contract, Rivera wrote a second phone number with the word brother. That number belonged to Sigfredo Garcia. On the day Rivera rented the Prius, Charlie Adelson called his parents' residence 3 times on calls that lasted a combined 44 minutes. That same day, there were 5 communications between Charlie Adelson and Katie Magbanua, and 32 communications or attempted communications between Katie and Sigfredo Garcia. Rivera would likely have needed money to rent the car. Perhaps there was a discussion about what color and make and model of vehicle to rent. Don't forget that Wendy's about-to-be permanently booted boyfriend at the time, Jeffrey Lacoste, drove a silver Nissan Altima that in profile bears a striking resemblance to a silver Prius. And after the crime, he went to the cops with a theory that Wendi may have been trying to frame him for the crime. It would appear that Wendi Adelson, the only legal expert in the Adelson family, didn't use her cell phone to call or text anything about a potential crime. Was she already doing all she could to distance herself from the crime? We know that after Charlie Adelson was convicted, Donna said in a jailhouse call with her son that she'd emailed Wendi and written, quote, "Everyone looks to protect you," end quote. What did Donna mean by that? Was Donna saying that everyone in the family looks to keep Wendy's name out of phone calls, emails, and texts so that the police can never definitively tie her to the crime? Wendi, as the ex-spouse, would have been suspect number 1 in the cops' eyes just by virtue of being the ex-spouse. Is that why everyone looks to protect her? This would imply Wendi was a co-conspirator, but that she was deliberately kept out of all the dealings, the phone calls, the emails, the texts. Some have speculated that perhaps Wendi was from the very beginning setting herself up to get off scot-free and to commit the perfect crime while allowing others in her family to do the dirty work and for them to be the ones to leave any accidental breadcrumbs that the cops might find. Likely, everyone in the Adelson family who was involved in planning the crime would have agreed that it can't look in any way as if Wendi were involved. They probably reasoned that if the cops were to get any inkling that Wendi was involved, that would lead them to the rest of the family members who were involved. So Wendi, if she is involved, and so far she's not been charged, as an attorney, would have known to cover her butt, and her family would have also wanted to cover her butt because drawing attention to her would have in turn drawn attention to them. Now let's review the communications that occurred between various parties on the day of the crime, Friday, July 18th, 2014. I'll be talking about the two hired hitmen, Sigfredo Garcia and Luis Rivera. I'll also be mentioning Katie Magbanua, who was Charlie's girlfriend back in 2014, as well as the baby mama to Garcia's two children. Such a tangled web. Then there's Charlie Adelson, of course, his mother Donna, who many believe to be the architect of the crime, and Wendi, who really only appears to have had a few calls and texts on that day with some key players. We'll be looking at who was calling whom and at what time, and who was calling other people after hanging up with someone else. I'll also share how long the calls lasted, and I'll speculate about what information may have been being discussed based on the times. You will see that there was a flurry of calls between all parties starting right after midnight on July 18th, the day of the crime. Thanks to GPS locations from their phones, we know that Garcia and Rivera arrived in Tallahassee, Florida, where Dan Markel lived, well before the hour when the crime went down. In fact, on Thursday, July 17th, Garcia and Rivera were driving around Tallahassee, scoping out locations and getting into mischief. Per Rivera, who ratted out Sigfredo and Katie when the police offered him a plea deal, he and Garcia were out on Thursday driving around and looking to score some of the white stuff to snort up their noses. And this is when Garcia accidentally fired the .38 revolver that Rivera would later tell the cops was used to hurt Markel. Garcia put a hole in the rented Prius's floorboard, and it severed the gas line. The car immediately ran out of gas, and the two hired hitmen had to push it over to the side of the road. While I'm tempted to call them the bad news bears of hitmen, I am reminded that they actually did accomplish the hit. Garcia was able to repair the gas line, problem solved, and the rental company was none the wiser, though I don't know how they explained the hole in the floorboard. After that, the duo returned to their hotel room, where Garcia proceeded to drink and snort, I guess. Rivera said he wasn't partaking in all of this stuff as much as Garcia was, because he knew he needed to be sharp, not to make any mistakes. But of course, even he had his moments of ineptitude. When looking out of the hotel room's window on Thursday, Luis noticed an owl in the parking lot, so he took a photo of it and he posted it to his Instagram, which noted that he was in Tallahassee. Katie Magbanua saw the post and immediately called to say, "Get that photo down right now." She was trying to minimize the breadcrumbs. Now, fast forward to 1 minute after midnight on Friday, July 18th, the day of the crime. That's when Katie calls Sigfredo. The call lasts for 1 minute and 12 seconds. Now, was this when Katie noticed the owl posted on Rivera's Instagram? Was she calling at this late hour to tell Rivera to take that photo down? Did she read Garcia the riot act, saying something like, "Don't be an idiot. You can't be posting stuff to Instagram and showing that you're in Tallahassee. Use your brain." Could she also have mentioned that Garcia and Rivera should set an alarm because they would need to keep an eye on the target the next morning, starting from when he left his home with his two sons to take them to daycare? Could Katie have said, "You guys can't lose sight of the target because you need to do him in when he's cornered somewhere alone. Don't hurt this guy when he's with his kids." Luis Rivera told the cops that he would never harm someone in front of their children, but we don't know if Garcia had the same sensibility. Charlie, and maybe Donna too, while ruthless, would likely have wanted Rivera and Garcia to know that they should not harm Markel when he was with the two little boys. I say maybe Donna because she hasn't been convicted of the crime yet, so she still enjoys a presumption of innocence. Did Katie maybe also tell Garcia and Rivera to turn their cell phones off before they drove to Dan Markel's house so that the cops couldn't use GPS to trace their location and thus trace them to the crime scene. We know that Katie told Garcia at some point that July 18th was when the crime needed to go down, and that was because Dan Markel had plans to travel to New York that weekend. Rivera described all of this in his interrogation on April 4th of 2016 when he agreed to share info in return for a plea deal. But I'm assuming Katie would have told Garcia this bit well before they arrived in Tallahassee. It would have been when they were deciding on which day the crime should take place. Now, Wendi was the only person who would have known Danny Markel's daily schedule, things like when he would need to drop his sons off at daycare in the morning. We also know from Wendi's interview on July 18th of 2014 that she was aware that Danny had plans to head to his gym after he dropped the boys off at daycare. Danny and Wendi also had plans to chat about their eldest son's school enrollment that Friday morning. We know this because Wendi told the investigator that Danny had called her at 9:02 a.m. that morning and he'd left a message telling her that he would be out of the gym by such and such time. And per Rivera, he and Garcia did indeed follow Danny from his house on Trescott Drive to the boys' daycare. Rivera said he and Garcia drove around the block several times when Danny took the boys inside. After that, Garcia and Rivera trailed Danny to the gym. But I'm getting too far into the day of July 18th right now that I wanted to. Let's go back to the minutes just after midnight that day and see who was contacting whom. So again, Katie called Sigfredo Garcia 1 minute after midnight, and the call lasted 1 minute. Then, a few minutes later, at 12:07 a.m., Charlie called Katie. The call lasted 7 minutes. Did Charlie know Katie had just spoken to Garcia? Did Charlie want to make sure that Katie told Garcia to turn off his and Rivera's cell phones prior to the crime? 27 minutes later, at 12:34 a.m., Katie calls Charlie. This call lasts for just 53 seconds. Was she giving Charlie a short yes or no answer to some question he had? About a half hour later, at 1:02 a.m., Charlie calls Donna Adelson, but she doesn't pick up. I'm assuming she was getting her beauty rest at this early hour. A minute later, at 1:03 a.m., Charlie calls Katie back. This time they talk for about 20 minutes. Was Charlie needing some info from Donna to share with Katie? Did he call Katie to say his mom didn't pick up? Then did Katie and Charlie go over last-minute details, reviewing the timeline for the upcoming hours, where the target would be and when? Or were they further refining how much money would be paid out to Rivera and Garcia and Katie? Whatever they talked about apparently didn't need to be passed on to Garcia and Rivera, because after this call, all phone activity ceases for a long stretch. This is presumably because Charlie and Katie went to bed. Maybe Garcia and Rivera were also conked out. Then, approximately 7 hours later at 8:09 a.m., Donna Adelson calls her daughter Wendi. The call lasts for just 35 seconds. We know from what Wendi told the investigator in her interview after the crime that she was at her house on Aqua Ridge Way at this point, waiting for a Best Buy repairman who was scheduled to look at her broken TV. Wendi and Donna then text about the appointment. Donna tells Wendi that Best Buy has just called and they're on their way out. Not long after Donna's text, Wendi texts the following note to Charlie, quote, "This is so sweet," end quote. Now, Wendi ended up deleting that text, so it didn't immediately appear on her phone when she handed the phone over to the investigators later that afternoon after the crime. Why did Wendi delete that text? To what was she referring when she told Charlie, "This is so sweet"? I'm thinking it likely was something about the crime, because why else would Wendi delete that particular text? Sounds like she didn't realize the cops would be able to retrieve deleted messages. Did Charlie tell Wendi something like, even though it's more expensive to hire a hitman than buy you a TV, it will be well worth the money if it makes you happy? Or did Charlie maybe text something like, I'm so excited that you and the boys will be moving to South Florida permanently, and I promise to be a role model for the boys. I'm speculating here, but clearly Charlie wrote something that made Wendi text back, this is so sweet. Maybe Charlie said, Wendi, I'm going to pay for the hitman and I'm going to get you another TV too. At 9:02 a.m., Dan Markel calls his ex-wife Wendi. The call lasts for just 1 minute. It's Dan leaving a message about needing to talk about their son Ben's school enrollment. Wendi was home with the TV repairman at this time. Why didn't she pick up the phone? Did she know that Ben's school enrollment in Tallahassee wasn't going to be an issue because soon she would be living permanently in South Florida? Or was Wendi busy talking to the TV repairman and thus not wanting to speak to Danny at that moment? 10 minutes later, at 9:12 a.m., Charlie calls Wendi. The call lasts for just 29 seconds. By the way, 9:12 a.m. is also, coincidentally, the time when Danny Markel's car pulled into the Premier Fitness gym parking lot. Why did Charlie call Wendi at 9:12 a.m.? Did he want to check on the TV repairman? According to Wendi, the repair guy was still at her house at this time, and he didn't leave until around 10 a.m. That repairman, by the way, may have been intended to help Wendi establish an alibi, but unfortunately the repairman didn't stay at Wendi's house until after the crime went down. He left about 48 minutes or so before Dan Markel was harmed. Thus, the Best Buy guy could not really offer a solid alibi for Wendi for the exact hour when Markel was injured. Wendi will later tell the investigator that she remained at home that morning working on a paper. Wendi said she emailed the paper to her university email so that citations could be done there at the university. Wendi also mentioned that she made last-minute plans to have lunch with two friends. I'm wondering if she made those plans because the repairman did not stay long enough for the crime to go down. Had he still been at her house at 11 a.m., maybe into the noon hour, she would not have needed anything else to establish an alibi. Wendi also said she did some laundry. Why does laundry always come up in true crime cases? Do you guys remember when Candace Bly, Summerwell's mother, told Chris of the interview room that one of the things she did on the afternoon when Summer vanished was laundry? At 9:19 a.m., Wendi calls Charlie back. They talk for 18 minutes and 17 seconds. That's a long call. What did they have to talk about on a work day, albeit summer break for Wendi, but not summer break for Charlie? Was it again to touch base about where Dan Markel was at that hour and when he would likely be home alone? Or was Charlie giving Wendi advice about how to react when the cops would later track her down after the crime for an interview? Was Charlie saying things like, remember, Wendi, don't start crying until after the cop tells you what happened and why they want to talk to you. Just act confused when they sit you down and wait to hear what they have to say. Once they tell you, you need to show some emotion, so maybe start bawling. Or maybe Charlie and Wendi were talking about other topics if Wendi really didn't know about the crime that was about to go down. An 18-minute call between Charlie and Wendi hours before the murder plot is going to happen is suspicious in my opinion. I don't think Charlie and Wendi would typically speak that long in the morning. Note that it was during the same time frame that Rivera and Garcia were captured on a surveillance video at Dan Markel's gym, Premier Health and Fitness. Both of the men's phones were also pinged to show them at that location. Garcia and Rivera were there waiting patiently for their target, Dan Markel, to exit the gym. Charlie and Wendi hung up from their 18-minute phone call at around 9:37 a.m. Now, a minute later at 9:38 a.m., right after hanging up with Wendi, Charlie calls Donna. The call lasts for just 30 seconds. You can't really accomplish much in 30 seconds. About 20 minutes later at 9:58 a.m., Charlie calls Katie Magbanua. The call lasts for 6 minutes. Was Charlie telling Katie about his conversation with Wendi? At 10 a.m., Sigfredo Garcia and Luis Rivera power off their cell phones. Garcia and Rivera are still sitting in the rented Prius in the Premier Gym's parking lot when they turn their phones off. Clearly, they don't want anyone being able to track their movements from the gym to Dan Markel's home, which is going to turn out to be the crime scene. But obviously, they didn't figure on the gym having a security camera that looked out on the parking lot. And they definitely didn't think about buses in Tallahassee having cameras that tracked the traffic around them. The cameras on the bus captured the rented light greenish silver Prius as it followed Dan Markel home. At 10:07 a.m., Katie calls Charlie, and they speak for just over a minute. At 10:08 a.m., Katie calls Charlie again. The call lasts for 9 seconds. Sounds like Charlie didn't answer. At 10:09 a.m., Charlie calls Katie back. This time Katie answers and they talk for 6 minutes and 3 seconds. So their call would have ended around 10:15 a.m. By now, the TV repairman has been gone from Wendi's house for about 15 minutes. Perhaps Wendi is busy writing her paper while also doing some laundry. And over at Premier Fitness, Dan Markel is well into his workout. At 10:38 a.m., Danny exits the gym. He doesn't know it, but he only has about 20 more minutes to live with his brain uninjured. The drive to his brick house at 2116 Truscott Drive would have taken about 10 to 14 minutes, depending on the traffic. As Danny's driving, at 10:48 a.m., he calls the school that Wendi has targeted for their son Ben to attend. Dan begins talking to a school administrator. About 3 minutes later, at 10:51 a.m., surveillance video footage from city buses captures Garcia and Rivera's rented Prius following Danny Markel down Thomasville Road and turning left onto Benton Road. So let's guesstimate that Danny pulled into his driveway around 10:52 or 10:53 a.m., with the Prius pretty much pulling up right behind him. Rivera said he parked the car about 3 to 4 feet behind Danny's car. Danny can't help but notice the Prius right behind him, and he halts his conversation with the school administrator to say, "There's a stranger in my driveway." After that, it could not have taken long for Garcia to exit the Prius, walk over to the driver's side door of Danny's black Honda Accord, raise the weapon, and fire twice at Dan Markel's face and head. Garcia would have wanted to do this as quickly as possible. He would not have wanted to linger at the crime scene. We know that Danny didn't even have a split second to tell the administrator he was talking to, "Please dial 911, or even to shout out, "No," when he spotted Garcia's face and the weapon. Also, Danny was found slumped over the wheel of the car with the motor still running. If he'd had any time, I would think Dan would have turned the car off. I know he was on the phone, but most people don't like to sit inside their car, inside their garage, with the car idling, even if the garage door is up. Although no one can cite the exact second that Danny was injured, again, I think it was probably around 10:53 a.m. We know that Danny's neighbor, Jim Geiger, dialed 911 at 11:02 a.m., and before Geiger made that call, he went over to Danny's driveway, looked inside the garage from a distance, saw that the car was running, and thought everything was likely okay, and that Danny was about to drive out of the driveway. Thus, Geiger returned to his home. But Geiger still had a slight misgiving, so after entering his home, he stood at the front window to make sure that Dan Markel pulled out of his driveway. When several minutes went by and Danny's car hadn't departed, Jim Geiger walked back over to Danny's garage to get a closer look. It was on this second look-see that Geiger noticed broken glass on the garage floor, saw a hole through the driver's side window, and spied Danny slumped inside the car. Geiger then had to run back home to dial 911 because he'd left his cell phone there. So quite a few minutes were lost before Geiger dialed 911 at 11:02 a.m. Then, at 11:06 a.m., Donna Adelson attempted to either call or text Charlie. Was anyone listening to the Tallahassee police radio feed that morning? By now, the police officer who first arrived at the crime scene had called for an ambulance. At 11:22 a.m., Charlie called Donna back, and they talked for about 7 minutes and 17 seconds. Just 1 minute earlier, at 11:21 a.m., that ambulance finally arrived at Danny's Truscott Drive home. Note that the ambulance arrived 19 minutes after Geiger's 911 call. Was Donna aware that 911 had been dialed? Did she tell Charlie about it? At 11:30 a.m., Charlie calls Katie. The call lasts just 30 seconds. Did Charlie simply say, "It's done"? At 11:31 a.m., Charlie calls Katie again. This time she picks up, and they speak for about 5 minutes. Was Charlie telling Katie more about the dark deed being done and the police being aware of the crime? Did Charlie know that Danny hadn't died at this point? No one except the medical personnel knew the extent of Dan Markel's injuries at this point. People may have known 2 shots were fired, but they didn't know how effective Garcia was in destroying Dan Markel's exceptionally brilliant brain. At 11:42 a.m., Wendi Adelson calls Danny Markel, presumably to talk about school enrollment for their son Ben. The call goes unanswered, as Danny is now on his way to the hospital, being worked on and assessed. Did Wendi know ahead of time that the crime was scheduled to go down right around 11 a.m.? Is that why she waited until 11:42 a.m. to call Danny back? Did she want her call to show up on his phone after the crime so that it looked like she had no clue he'd been injured? Remember, Danny called Wendi much earlier that day at 9:02 a.m. You'd think Wendi would have called him earlier. Next, per Wendi, she leaves her house around noon or 12:15 p.m. I say both of these times because she mentions both of them in her police interview. Thus, it's hard to know which one is more accurate. Not long after this, Wendi is right at Truscott Drive. She tells the police she was on her way to a liquor store nearby to purchase a bottle of bourbon. Never mind that the liquor store was out of her way, and she could have gone to any number of other liquor stores closer to home. Wendi says she sees the yellow crime scene tape. She later tells the investigator she thought the crime scene tape was there due to a fallen tree, which is a convenient excuse because she didn't call the daycare when she saw that scary tape to double check that her kids were okay. Nor did she call her ex Danny to see if he was okay. Many feel that perhaps Wendi drove near Truscott to verify that the crime had occurred. Thus, Wendi knew in her police interview that she needed a good reason to explain why she wasn't panicked and making phone calls when she saw the yellow tape. Thinking that a tree has fallen makes for a perfectly benign excuse for not panicking at that moment. I'm wondering if Wendi was able to somehow get news of the crime down to Charlie and Wendi and Katie. I'll explain why in just a second. At 12:29 p.m., Sigfredo Garcia's phone received text messages, which indicates the phone was powered up. Immediately 1 minute after that, at 12:30 p.m., Garcia calls Katie. This is the first contact initiated by Garcia after the crime. Katie doesn't pick up, and the call goes to voicemail. But then Katie calls Garcia right back. At this point, Garcia and Rivera are about an hour and a half into their 7-hour road trip back to Miami. The call lasts just 44 seconds. This is likely when Garcia told Katie, quote, "It's done." Katie, per Luis Rivera, replied, "I know." How did Katie know that the crime had happened before Garcia called her? Again, had Wendi been able to get a message to Charlie and Donna? Or did someone hear the police traffic on a scanner? Now, as all these people are chatting back and forth after the crime on July 18th, Dan Markel's ex-wife, Wendi Adelson, was picked up by the Tallahassee police from a restaurant called Mosaic, where she'd had lunch with 2 friends. The cops drove Wendi straight down to the Tallahassee Police Department for an interview with a detective. This was around 2:45 p.m. Later on that evening, while Wendi is still in the interview room, she mentions wanting to call her parents to let them know what happened to Danny. Wendi calls her mom, Donna, at 7:03 p.m. During that call, Wendi asked Donna to call Charlie and tell him what happened. Call records show that Donna did then call Charlie's cell phone at 7:11 p.m., but that call went to voicemail. 2 minutes later, at 7:13 p.m., Charlie returns Donna's call. Charlie and Donna spend nearly 6 minutes on the phone. Donna is maybe telling Charlie what Wendi said when she called from the police interview room. At 7:29 p.m., Charlie calls Donna again. This time they speak for 6 minutes and 31 seconds. Perhaps Charlie was asking Donna how and when she would bring cash over to pay Garcia and Rivera the next day. Then, at 7:36 p.m., Charlie calls Katie Magbanua's cell phone. The call lasts 2 minutes and 49 seconds. During this call is Charlie giving Katie a quick summary of what Donna told him regarding Wendi being down at the police station with a detective. Was Charlie telling Katie about when he would pay Garcia, Rivera, and her? At 6:46 p.m., Luis Rivera makes a cash withdrawal of $40 from an ATM in Pembroke Pines, a suburb of Fort Lauderdale. The surveillance camera footage from this will prove important, as it clearly shows Garcia and Rivera in the rented Prius post the crime. 2 hours after Garcia and Rivera are back in Miami, cellular location data shows Katie leaving her apartment and driving to Rivera's residence while attempting to call Garcia. Then cellular location data shows Katie, Garcia, and Rivera being in the same area together. It's also around this time, 10:22 p.m., that Katie calls Charlie Adelson. After this, Katie doesn't use her phone until the next morning, and we know Katie spent the night with Charlie at his house. Between 3 a.m. and 3:30 a.m., Sigfredo Garcia tries to reach Katie 3 more times by cell phone. All the calls go to voicemail. Katie doesn't use her phone again until the next morning at 9:44 a.m. when she tries to reach Garcia as she's driving away from Charlie's house. All this time, Harvey Adelson has managed to stay out of the call activity. Next to Wendi, he seems to be the savviest of the Adelsons, if he was involved in the plot. Of course, Harvey hasn't been charged, at least not yet, and thus he, like Wendi, is presumed innocent, as is Donna at this time. I'd love to know your thoughts on all these calls. What do you think all the chatter back and forth that day was about? Until the next time on Bed Crime Stories.